What we're going to do this morning is to take you through what would normally be covered in one semester in a very brief 1 hour overview of the subject called representation design. Welcome. Sorry. All right. And the good thing about the way this lecture theatre is designed is that the only way you can sneak past the lecturers if you're late is to duck your head and come in. Anyhow, good morning, welcome in. Right, so we're going to go through that very quickly. And if I had planned this a little bit more in advance, then I would have done a bit of a demo with Chris later on. But unfortunately, I've been less organized than I should have. And we will not quite do the demo today. But we can demonstrate some of the stuff that we've been working on perhaps another time during the summer school.
There may be time. We do a lunchtime demo.
Yeah, we could do that. It's just that within an hour, it's a bit tight if you wanted to leave some room for some discussion. Okay, right. So the question is, what is representation design? We've come across the term now and again. It's not a very well-known term because it comes from, not from HCI, but more from the area of research in the human factors and the people working with in psychology and human perception. A couple of guys, John Flack and Kevin Bennett, do a lot of work in this particular area. And there's a whole body of other kinds of researchers, ranging from people like Jens Rasmussen in the what they call the cognitive systems engineering field, right through to Kim Vicente, who was one of his students, one of his co-workers, and others, Kathy Burns, and so on in this particular area. Now, very quickly, what is representation design? Primarily, it is an approach to user interface design. Okay, that's what it is. But the idea behind it is, how do you use human perception abilities so that you can communicate as much information as possible and as quickly as possible to the people? Some of the early ideas that they worked with, like object displays, you probably come across those terms where they use an octagon or some kind of spiderweb diagrams, where you have a solid object where the dimensions of the object are used as representations of various parameters of processes that have been controlled. They are mapped onto this particular object. So when you see this object as it's in a regular shape, let's say an octagon, and it's in this regular octagonal shape, it tells you that the system that you're controlling, for example, is in perfect condition. But when some of the edges or the dimensions of the objects are out of sync, it tells you that some part of the system is not working properly, and very quickly you can pick these things up. So that's some of the background to the kind of areas that these people are coming from. What they're also looking at as well, in order to do that kind of mapping, what they call semantic mapping, is to first of all identify what are the key characteristics and the important relationships that exist in the system that are meaningful to be mapped onto such a representation form. Okay, so that's what they are trying to do. So you want to be able to say, look, what are those important values or functions that operate in that cause the system to operate in a particular way, and you want to see how that is represented. For example, you may be interested in knowing how a hydroelectric power station, for example, how its water flows relates to the amount of electricity generated. Yeah, and that you want electricity generated to be in a particular given safe band. And you want that safe band to ensure that at the same time, the amount of water and electricity generating is profitable. Okay, so you want to know how much is each turn or each cubic of water that is being pumped through your hydroelectricity system. is generating profits for the organization, right? And if you have a very large safety boundary, let's say 20% of your capacity as a safety area, then for the company that's profit, where profit is a key concern or key driving force, that's 20% of profit that you're not making. So you want to know what are those functions, what are those relationships between how much water, for example, which pipes, which flow rates, what levels of electricity output that the system can handle, because if you put too much electricity out into the system, your grid suffers as well. Okay, so you need to be able to balance all those off, and you need to find that relationship and say, how does all that link into the profit, for example. So this group of people were looking at these kinds of things. So safe systems, complex systems, find those key relationships, map them onto some kind of a visual representation. And these visual representations are not just any kind of geometric shape, but it's some kind of shape that allows you, or some kind of representation form that allows you to pick up information very quickly. And there's a whole body of research on some of these things that stems into the areas of pre-attentive processing of information that allows us to pick up the cues and patterns in the visual areas that, from what we see, that we can then detect changes very rapidly. And I'll go through some of those things a little bit more later on. But by means of explanation, that's sort of where we're at with representation design as an introduction and definition. Okay? Now, the other area that you've got to sort of understand as well is this notion of abstractions. Now, there's a couple of quotes which are actually quite nice, but let me go through what these two quotes mean up here. Complex systems can be described at various levels of abstraction. Yeah, you can have the physical layer of the system that shows you the pipes in interrelationship, or a physical network, or if you're talking about computer system network. And then you have functional layers in between. Certain things do certain things. As in a car, for example, you think about a car. You have the infrastructure, the wheels, the chassis. And then you have a fuel system. Okay? And all these things are separate physical components. But these separate components, fuel system, the air conditioning system, whatever, have got reasons for being there. So you need some kind of mechanism, a function that tells you how they are, each of them are performing individually, and then each of them performing collectively as a whole. And then you want to be able to say, look, if something fails in the car, in the car or in a fairly complex system, then you want to know at which level is it that has fallen down. So if you can find ways in which you can then map these relationships across these kinds of systems, then you can say, okay, the car is not moving. Why? Because one of the systems has failed. Then you can reason through the system and say, look, that part of the car, the fuel system, or there's a leak in the pump because there isn't enough pressure coming through in some of the hydraulic systems, and that's why it is not moving. All right. So that allows you to give you a fairly deep understanding of what is it that the relationships within that kind of system you're dealing with. So what has it got to do with visual analytics? What has it got to do with the whole area of large data sets? A large data set really is, in a way, a very large, complex system. It has many dimensions. It has many different aspects of the data. It has many groups of data that's associated with it. And what you're looking for at the end of the day, I mean, let me give you an example. Government social services information. A lot of it's published online nowadays. Unlike the old days, you can walk up to a welfare or social service office and say, look, can you give me a hand with this? Now a lot of information is up on the web. Unfortunately, you've got health information in one website, you've got social services in another, you've got benefits in another, you've got housing information in another, you have tax credits somewhere else, and so on. Now, a person who needs to have access to those kinds of benefits needs to find his way around all of those pieces of systems, separate, different silos, link the relevant stuff together in his head, join them up so that he knows that, oh, I am that category of person that the policies are referring to, and therefore I can have access to these kinds of services. So when you have to connect all these kinds of systems together, there are ways in which you can allow the connection to be made, and if you can assist the person to make those kinds of connections, rather than having the person piece through those things, which is what we're trying to do when we are as analysts. As an intelligence analyst, for example, you have information that comes in through many different sources. Not just a single source, but information that comes from different sources. Some of them reliable, some of them unreliable, some of them highly structured, some of them unstructured entirely. And you need to piece them together. So what you're also trying to do here is to find that piece of meaningful thread that runs through that data. So in terms of the complexities of these kinds of systems, what you're also trying to do is the same thing. You're trying to find the relationship that exists within the data set. Now, in the area of cognitive systems engineering, one of the key things that they talk about as well is how do you go about creating that kind of identifying and relating those important characteristics together. Some of the approaches that deals with some of these things have been embedded, have been embodied within a technique or an approach called cognitive work analysis. Okay? Now, I won't have any time at all to go through all of that because, like I said, it's too much. Except to very briefly say what they are. Okay? Now, in what Kim Vicente talks about in his book on cognitive work analysis, he describes how you can use a whole suite of different methods, okay, to understand what are the complex relationships that exist within the system, and then how you go about understanding how you manage those relationships. Like, for example, in a power system, there are certain thermodynamic relationships that exist. Now, there are ways in which an expert controller brings a system up to the right temperature quickly enough without having overshoot the system, the particular temperature because of the time lags, okay, and then bring it back down to the optimal operating temperatures. Now, look, there are strategies that allows you to do that, and you want to be able to know what they are, so that you can then assist the experts or the other operators in being able to bring the system up to speed quickly, for example. And then there are competencies and there are ways in which jobs are organized. So if you're talking about collaborative work, for example, you want to know what are the complementary skills, you want to know how those complementary skills work together, and you want to know how to support people in these kinds of complementary work. So there's a collaborative aspect to it, or if you're just a lone worker, which is seldom the case nowadays, you find that then you need to be able to identify what those skill sets are and then put them in place so that the system can be designed to support those kinds of competencies, requirements, and then therefore the worker competencies that allows that to happen. Okay, so very briefly, so this the particular framework allows you to then create various levels of abstraction, which can then be built up to help you understand what are the relationships that needs to be represented, and then what are the skill sets required in terms of not just physical, but in terms of the cognitive skill sets that are required to deal with this particular relationships. Okay, and then how you build them into the social organization, the workflow patterns, and so on, and then how you map them across onto a display. Now, in the original work of cognitive systems engineering by Rasmussen and his colleagues, they stop short of describing how you go about designing such an interface. They talk about it, but they don't tell you how. So Kim and his students, Kathy Burns, then took that a little bit further ahead and says, look, this is how you go about designing it. And that approach to designing these kinds of interfaces is what they call ecological interface design. Now, EID, as some people call it, is not about designing an interface for an ecological environment, as in nature or whatever. But what they're talking about is how do you map visual affordances onto the necessary relationships that you're trying to present to the user that are important to the user in terms of its job and characteristics of the particular work environment. Okay, so that's a very brief introduction to the subject, and then we now need to take you down another step. All right. What we have here is a very old diagram that was published in 1994 by Vicente and Pollock to describe the underlying model of how you can map three things together. Okay, the processes that you're controlling through to the interface onto the mental model of the operator, sometimes known as the agent. What they're trying to do here is that they're showing to you over here something called the abstraction hierarchy. Okay, how you decompose a system into its different levels of abstraction. Okay, so that you have high-level purposes, let's say profit or system safety, whatever that may be, right? Functions generalized at some level that bring together separate functions of physical nature. For example, in the car, you have your hydraulics, you have your fuel systems, you have your power transmission systems, and so on. Right? And how you then bring all of these together in a way that allows you to then track the necessary data. Okay? In many of the systems that we have that deals with complex systems, they simply show the information that comes up from here. Now, in the EID approach, what they're saying is that you should then take this information and find ways of mapping them into visual forms that allows you to do two things. One is that very quickly to detect the changes in the system. Secondly, you want to be able to reveal to the user the space of the possible operations that you can then deal with. All right? Now, if you understand what is that scope of variability that is that allows the system to operate in, then you can say, look, no, I don't want to use this particular pathway because it's not going to give you the optimal outcomes. I want to use some other strategy that controls the system that still gives me the same outcome. But if you are stuck with a set of procedures and a black box behind it, then you can only push one button that says either it comes on or it comes off. Like, for example, in this system over here, the lighting system, this is supposedly meant to work for an idiot. Right? It's got 4 buttons: scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. Many of you probably have come across such systems for changing lightings. Scene 1 is really bright, scene 2 is less bright, scene 3 is less bright, scene 4 is really less bright. Okay. However, many a time when you're trying to work that, you can never control it so that you don't have any of the lights shining on the display. Now, if they had a different way of mapping the switches to the lights, right? I can then say, look, I want that side of the classroom to be bright, whereas here to be really dim. So if I had 4 switches, lights 1, 2, 3, 4, or some sort, then I can just switch off which rows of lights I choose to fit my desires. And I can see what I'm doing is visible. All right? So that mapping becomes more meaningful to me because what I'm trying to achieve is, let's say, for example, is to make this screen brighter in relation to the rest of the room. So what do? Scene 4 then becomes really dark and everybody goes to sleep. Or scene 1, which is really bright and I can see everybody's eyes, but nobody can see the screens, right? So what you're trying to do here is to create that kind of mapping. But in order to do that kind of mapping, you need to understand what is the basic relationships that you're trying to represent on the system. So in that simple example, that kind of mapping can be done very easily if you understand what the system is available, what kinds of operations are available to you. The kind of decisions can be made very easily. But if you are stuck with scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, and scene 4, you can't make those kind of choices. You can't tweak the system. You can't optimize it as an expert operator. Okay. So that's what they're trying to say, okay? How do you go about mapping that? And then in terms of the operator space, they talk about a framework called the SRK framework. Skills, rules, and knowledge-based behaviors. At these 3 levels of behaviors, okay, some of the things are dealt with at a very instinctive level. If I see a red light, I hit the brakes, or I press a particular button. There are some very basic controls that you need in order to run a system. Okay? Then there's some where you need some interpretation, and there are certain rule-based behaviors, the R. You want to know that, okay, if this, and this happens, there are certain conditions under which you then need to activate a certain procedure. So these are also known and these are studied. Now the difficulty comes when an unknown situation or an unusual situation occurs. And these are usually precursors to an accident, or when an accident actually occurs, or when there's a failure in the system. And every darn light goes off in your control center. Okay? What is the problem? So at that level, you then start need to diagnose as to see where has the problem occurred. Now in hydroelectricity generating control centers, or even in other kinds of nuclear power plants, for example, when an alarm goes off, a simple alarm goes off, a simple shot, okay, in the circuits, you get as in the range of 240 alarms in 1 minute. How do you diagnose that? How on earth do you trace back? And every minute, because it's a cascading system, okay, the first minute, 240. The next minute, it goes up, not linearly, geometrically. And the minute you do that, there's no way in which you can trace where your source or something has happened. Because oftentimes, the root cause of your failure is not where the alarms went off, but somewhere else. So you need to be able to find ways in which you can then diagnose that. So in terms of some of the work that these people are doing, okay, they want to be able to support that level of reasoning as well as the lower level of control. So you need to be able to find ways in which you can then represent the rest of the ecology of that workspace, so that people can then say, look, okay, there's something else that's happening over here that I can see and I can fix. But if I cannot see it, if I cannot perceive where it is, I can't fix it. Okay? So what you're talking about is how do you then reveal it so that the human at the knowledge level, when something anomalous happens, I can diagnose it, I can seek to understand what the problem is and attempt to fix it. Okay. What that means from that side to this side, okay, primarily is this. At this level, we're trying to understand what are the functional relationships. So what to model and what to represent. How do you go about identifying these things? And as I said earlier on, there are methods by which we can do those kinds of analysis. In the visual analytics field, I'll come to that in a short while. Okay? Then we need to ask ourselves, what form should the visual representation take so that it allows us to do all those things that I just talked about? Okay? What is the way in which it should be represented? And I'll show you a few of these examples in a short while. And then you want to understand what's the purpose of having that kind of information in that particular format. So you need to understand the kinds of decisions to be made and the nature of those kinds of decisions. So are they purely, I'm going to control this particular system kind of thing, or am I trying to make sense out of the information that's being presented to me? Or am I looking at, in the case of visual analytics cases, is it for investigative purposes? I'm trying to know what information I need to pull out from different spaces. Or in some cases, we also talk about, I just want to be aware of what is going on in my processes and my system and in my surrounding environment, so that I can then find ways in which to connect them. Okay. And we will come to this lot in a short while. Okay, I'm just going to show you what these things, some of these tools are. Some of you may have seen this. It's called a means and abstraction hierarchy. It gives you a way of systematically decomposing a system into different levels of abstraction according to different systems and subcomponents. Okay? I won't go through this because it's going to take too much time. And just to show you what it means, okay? In a very simple system, the level of decomposition starts to break down into this particular way, where you have the high level functions up there, and then they're broken right down into low level pipes and flow. Now this is a very simplified representation of the hydroelectricity power generation system and the snowy hydro in Australia. And then we talked about the interface, yeah? So this was one of the designs that we sort of generated as a result of that piece of work. The integrated, at that point in time, a very new concept called profit in the electricity generation market. Back in those dark days, profit wasn't an issue in power generation. It was a service provided by the government, so to speak. So all the water you pump out, it doesn't really matter, because it's just going to go down the river anyhow, and it will be irrigating somebody's farm down the river. But the minute they deregulated the industry and made it competitive, and then profit became a measuring stick for the industry, all that changed. Every cubic of water that you run off that is not generating profit is water wasted. It's profit not earned. And when you're talking about millions of dollars of electricity a day, that's a lot of money. So what we needed to do was to connect hydrology, transmission, generation with the market forces. You needed to understand spot pricing of the electricity market, because they are being sold at the spot prices, as well as hedges, because there are some electricity is being sold in advance. And then you need to be able to connect that to the planning cycles. Okay? And what this particular diagram was hoping that we were trying to do was to be able to connect these few different relationships together. I won't go through this particular diagram in any detail at all, except to show you that sometimes it can be fairly complex, but what they're trying to do is to reveal the relationships between pumps, markets, energy targets, which is relevant to the market's performance and so on. Okay, generating capacities and so on. Now, this was one of the early prototypes. I'm not allowed to reveal to you the actual one that was eventually accepted by the company for confidentiality reasons, and we never got. We were told to give it up to the company. Anyhow, because in those days, when you have a tool such as that allows you to know if I will generate 2 cubics of water to generate so much electricity, it will pump up your profits by so much at that particular time. It was a competitive advantage killer, right? It just gave you that little edge that allows you to know how and when I need to put my pump into operation at a profit. Okay. Now, to help you understand this notion of being able to see what the ecology of your workspace is about, I thought I'd try to show you this particular photograph. I don't think it comes up very clearly, but I think it's good enough to be able to see that it's a photograph from my old office when I was still working back in New Zealand at the University of Otago. That's the Otago Harbour out there, okay, a big piece of water. And that's the Otago Peninsula. And this is a roadway, some buildings, more roadways, a bridge, and this is the water of the Leith, a small river, okay, a bridge, footpaths that lead out across there to a marina, and then water up there, okay. So this is generally your terrain, your picture. Now, in the Gibsonian world of visual affordances, okay, what we're trying to see here is, how do we interpret the world? How we interpret the world is highly dependent on what we want to achieve as well. Okay, so it's situated, right? So if I want to get across to that part of the terrain, I know I have a few pieces of obstacles I need to get through. Now, what I'm trying to do with that particular objective is to find a path that allows me to get there. Okay? Now, if I can see all of the space of possibilities that's available to me, I can find and decide, given my physical condition or my resources available to me, or the kinds of assets that I have, I can then find a way that will best get me across there. If I have lots of money, for example, as a student, I'm not wealthy in those days, I could take a taxi that goes right around there and cost me an arm and a leg, because that's a very long way around. Okay, that's one option. Now, if I was a little bit more physically fit than I am, I could find a path that says, look, I could walk down here, run along the riverbanks to the marina and swim across. Okay, that's another possible path, another passage that I could use, right? So what I'm saying here is that, look, in this photograph of this particular terrain, this represents the ecology of the environment for that organism, which is me in this stage. And I'm trying to find pathways across. Now, if I was given a black box and says, push button if you need to get from here to there. Black box says, taxi, it's going to cost you $150, and that's the only option you have. You're stuck. And if you haven't got $150, right? But if you know what are the possibilities available to you, you can now start to see there may be other pathways, other ways in which you could get across. You could create them, because you can create possibilities. Okay? Or the possibilities are open to you. Now, this basic concept of how we view the world is then implemented into the design principles. What they are looking for are representations of your workspace that allows you to then reveal that space of possibilities. Now, okay, so that's, with that particular concept, we then move into another domain. In another piece of work that we dealt with Eurocontrol, we did a piece of work on creating a radar display to help air traffic controllers manage airspace in the year 2025 and beyond. Okay, that was the remit. So something fairly far ahead. What you see here is a snapshot of a mock-up of a radar display. Okay, so these are aircraft coming together and so on. Now, one of the tasks of the air traffic controller has to do is conflict detection and resolution. Okay, you don't want aircraft to come together and crash, right? So you want to make sure that they are reasonably separated, either distance, physical distance apart, horizontal distance, and vertically. Okay, so 5 miles and vertically 1,000 feet. You want to make sure that they don't ever come together on any trajectory. Very unfortunate if they do. Okay, so there are many. There's a number of tools out there that deals with the conflict detection and resolution, automated tools. Oftentimes, controllers don't use them, even though they are operations for a variety of reasons. There's too many false alarms. Aircraft coming together, but I know they're going to turn away at this point because the route that says that, but because of the way they're coming together, the system tells you, okay, there's a conflict alert, please do something about these guys. They're coming closer together. Please do something about these guys. Coming closer together. Something where they're actually going to turn away. But that's the nature of some of the automated systems. Some of them are a bit more intelligent than others, but yes. So we took a different approach and says, can we use the concept of ecological interface design to build these things? And one of the key things as we started to analyze what are the relationships that are important to a controller, okay, that allowed us to come up with this was the fact that it is a separation between aircraft that's important, not where the aircraft are in where they are. Okay, it is the separation between them, and whether that separation is closing or that separation is moving apart. That's what's important in the controller. That's what they're looking for. But in all radar displays, they tell me where the aircraft are. Okay, so we came up with a concept called the relative position vectors, RPVs. The RPVs work in a very simple way. They just tell me what is the relationship between, what is the separations between one aircraft and every other aircraft in that space. Okay. So if we did this purely on an XY basis, all right, one safety unit is just a normalized way of being able to say, look, it is more than 5 miles and 1,000 feet away. Okay, it's just a very simple tool that we use. So as you can see, all right, if this is the red line that says it's one safety unit that's within one safety unit, which pairs of aircraft are in danger of coming together? Straight away, it's very easy to pick up. These two, okay? And any aircraft that are beyond the red line are safe. I don't have to worry about them. Any pairs of aircraft that are out there, I don't have to worry about them, because I'm looking at separations rather than aircraft. And if they are, like in this case, approaching the red line, then I need to have a little bit of a concern. I need to think about it. I need to see, are they really going to come together, or do I need to do something else? Yeah, I no longer have to control them to watch out for conflicts. I just look at the display, and I can see, like in this case, an aircraft that is within the safety unit is not concerned, primarily because why? The separation is increasing. Okay, it's moving in the other direction, right? So this is one basis on which you can then apply such concepts of ecological design. Okay. However, there are limitations to this particular way of representing separations. It requires a lot of space. So we came up with a different design that we then use that same XY, but we now wrapped it around in a circular form that had the red circle and every other pairs moving out elsewhere in other directions. It doesn't really matter which directions they're moving, as long as they're moving towards or away. It's that's what you're looking for. But the idea is that you can then now see where every pairs of aircraft and their relationships are in terms of the conflict detection. Okay. So you need to start thinking a fair amount in terms of what you visualize, what you design. Most of you are going to end up designing some system or other. How do you go about visualizing those things? And what do they mean? we've seen a lot of pictures around. Visualizations have been around for as long as cavemen, so to speak. But in those days, they weren't representing abstract things. They were representing fairly concrete things. You know, the deer, the bulls, or whatever they were trying to herd or to farm or to hunt, right? And they tell stories. They're physical representations. And then it became a little bit more abstract. And William Playfair's work on the balance of exchange, balance of payments between different countries, Great Britain and other countries. Very easy to see how the balance of payments changed in 1760, 1765 kind of period, to say when it became favorable, when it was unfavorable. One of the earliest graphics around that showed the abstraction of what's important to people. And more, I mean, look, this is other kinds of ways in which you represent information. Yeah, train timetables, okay, New York, New Haven, difficult to see patterns in them. Difficult to see when there are more trains and less trains. Take a look at this one. You don't have to read it. When are the trains most likely to occur? What time of the day? Now take a look at this one. Okay? Straight away, it is very clear to you which part of the day there's plenty of trains. Okay? They use a leaf and stem kind of a chart representation. Okay? One peak here, another peak over here. And it tells you what time it is that they're occurring. The structure of those timetable is revealed to you very easily, right? Same, it's information about times of trains' arrivals, but it reveals the structure very nicely to the reader. Okay. What about this one? What's that slide about? What's this one about?
It's probably about selling something.
Selling something, yeah. Anything else? Any other offers? Let's have a closer look. It's telling you that this great girl over here has got really nice legs. Yeah? The important information is actually hidden, unfortunately, in the graph that's embedded by that lady. This is the important information. The graph, right? The price of diamonds over a period of time. Now, sometimes, the visualizations can be so bad that they do really silly things with them. So much so that the real information that you want to communicate is lost. Because everything else around it is so salient. It captures your attention so easily that what's important has just gone by. Okay. Again, that's another design consideration, salience. Important pieces of information, you want to make it salient, not the less important information that is salient or eye-catching. Right? What about this one? Any guesses? This graphic was voted or nominated as one of the best graphics for a week in last year, I believe. On this particular website. Sorry? Something. Yeah. It's very difficult to see what it is without somebody explaining to you what they are. It's the topics that were published in the popular science magazines in clusters of topics over a period of time in the last 100 years. Really hard to see it unless you actually had somebody explain what they are to you. In a way, it's useful. It reveals to you a particular train of topics and so on. There's a lot of information in there, but it's not clear. It's difficult for you to understand it, and you need to spend a lot of time to have somebody explain to you. Okay. Now, in order for us to design, therefore, visualizations, we do need to have a different concept, a different set of assumptions, right? It is not just creating pretty pictures. Okay? We need to be able to understand what are those relationships that we're trying to represent. And when we spoke to a group of Intel analysts a couple of years ago, we asked them, what is it that they do? Is it just information search and retrieval? Unfortunately, if that was the case, then the job would have been very simple. But because there's a lot more things that happen, their queries are often very ill-formed and exploratory. I really don't know what I'm looking for, but I know it when I see it. It's going to be interesting and has some value to me. But I don't know what specifically to search for until I happen to get there. Okay, the whole process of searching is connected with learning. As I understand the topic a lot more, I then can construct a better search that narrows down what is it I'm looking for. As I understand what's available in the data set, it permits me to ask more questions specifically. And when that happens, then I connect with the data. I say, oh, is that what it is? Now, when you are looking at this particular diagram, until I told you what it is about, there was no, oh, I know what you're talking about, right? But when I explain to you that it is about topics for a period of time, it starts to make sense. And then you can start asking questions about these things. You can then ask questions about what types of topics were done, were popular at what points in time, for example. Okay, so the filtering, classifying, indexing, and organizing of data is something else that you need to be able to do. And then make sense of the way the information is presented or organized so that you can find some ways of communicating them. Okay, so this is what we term as a process of sense making, of being able to understand what the data is about. Most of you are familiar with this model, the Piroli card model that talks about how the different stages of information, search and retrieval, by the intelligence and analysts and understanding is carried out. For those of you who are not too familiar with it, what it basically tells you is that there is two basic loops. One where you have what he calls a foraging loop, where you're looking for information, cataloging them, indexing them, putting them together, organizing them, and so on. And when you sort of get a sense of what it is, then you start saying, I think there's some kind of relationship of the stuff here, and I move this loop of data together, and to create some kind of a hypothesis that you attempt to then prove. Now, in my view, this model has been around for a while. It's not helpful in trying to understand what are the mental processes that goes on in order to understand that kind of data. Gary Klein and his colleagues, and one of his co-authors is up there, Robert, came up with a model of sense making called the data frame model. Now, this particular data frame model allows us to reason about these kinds of issues, which are not very clearly spelled out in the Piroli card model. Okay, it allows us to say, look, what happens when you are trying to make sense of information? There's a connection stage. I need to understand what's in the data, and I need to be able to then, that allows me to then ask questions about the data. And when I understand what's there, I can then seek out more information that allows me to further learn about what the subject or the data set contains, and how I can then interrogate it. At the same time, it tells me, look, I need to be able to ask questions about it. It allows me to ask, why some things happen in a particular way, okay? Or if there are inconsistencies or anomalies, why do they exist in a particular data set? At the same time, it then allows me to say, that means my assumptions was wrong when I first sort of thought I understood what the data was about. It allows me to then reframe my thinking about the data, and how do I go about doing that. Now, I find this model a very helpful model in understanding what analysts are trying to do. They're trying to make sense of it and draw some conclusions, of course. But it allows me to then say, look, these are the kinds of structures that I need to put in place to support the design of the user interface. Okay, the user interface then needs to support these kinds of reasoning processes. Now, that kind of reasoning processes then needs to be embedded in some kind of workspace. Now, we call that kind of workspace a reasoning workspace. Okay, you need to have an access to a design space, to a space called a data space that allows you to see what's in the data, that allows you to then analyze and find relationships within them, and then to create hypotheses and find ways of creating conclusions, right? Now, what I mean about the data space, I'll come back to this in a while. Hang on, yeah. Okay, right. Okay, so that's where we are. Okay, the reasoning workspace. So for us, this is a way of guiding the relationships creation within a particular design of the user interface. All right. Now, in our work in this particular area, what we found was that we have listed a very short list of about 20 representation design problems that we need to be able to address in creating user interface representations for visual analytics purposes. There's a whole long list of them. I'm not going to go through them because it's going to take too much time to deal with it. But I'm going to go through just 3 of these representation design problems as an example of how we translate some of those concepts into it, EID concepts into it. Okay. Now, one of them is known as the keyhole problem. Okay, the first problem is the keyhole problem. It's like taking a look of the big room, small keyhole, and you're peering through the keyhole, the cathedral, for example, and you're trying to look into what the cathedral inside looks like through a small keyhole. Very difficult. You have to look at one side, remember it, take a look at the next picture, remember it, take a look at the next picture, remember it, take a look at the next picture, remember it, and then try and piece them together. That's what we're doing all the time on the computers because it's such a small space. Now, this concept came about from some of the work that David Woods did some many years ago. But our problem is actually complicated even further from the cathedral example. Okay, you have multiple data sets, right? Multiple data sets that are organized such that you have a box of jigsaw puzzles, right? The box of jigsaw puzzle is then emptied out, chucked on top of the table, and you are required to, through that keyhole, make sense of all the pieces, join them together, create some kind of a picture of what is being represented in the jigsaw, right? Only problem is that you have more than one jigsaw. You have heaps of other jigsaws tossed in, and we've taken the box tops and we've thrown them away, and you're required to then piece them together. So no context, or very little context. Okay. And yesterday's talk was quite interesting. Jason Barron's talk about the castle. I like his castle. The castle is like the box of data sets that you have to look with. And he talks about trying to understand where things are in the rooms and so on, right? Now, in order to do that, you need some kind of map. Now, there are some tools that allow you to create maps, visual maps of the data space. And some of these tools are like, I couldn't quite get a better picture. I need to ask Richard for a better picture of Inspire's galaxy views. But these kind of galaxy views shows you high-level maps of the data space. These are thematic representations of what data is contained within the data space, which you can then interrogate and do things else. Okay, it's a map. Now, in the next kind of design, we look a little bit at some of the concepts of pre-attentive processing. Now, this summary of some of the work that's gone on helps you very quickly understand what we're talking about. Which is the odd thing out over here? very quickly you can pick it up, right? This particular object. In this particular one, which is the odd object up? Okay, won't finish in time.
You won't.
Over here, size and width. In this area, what is it that's odd? Yeah, so very quickly you can pick them up, right? So a lot of work by Andreesman and some of the other people have done a lot of work in this area to find that these kinds of capabilities in human ability to detect changes or differences of patterns very easily. They have, and others have worked towards saying, look, we can make use of this pre-attentive capability of the human to create visual patterns and to use them to help us see things. So imagine that these are 4 bar charts representing engine performance of an aeroplane. Okay, so engine 1, engine 2, engine 3, engine 4, as you see them on the LCD displays. Straight away, if something happens, you can tell one of them isn't working right. Which one? Number 1, number 2, number 3, or number 4? Very easy to tell, right? As soon as they break the emergent feature of a line that created by the tops of those boxes, okay, there's a break in the pattern. You can detect them very quickly. So making use of this principle, okay, we then look at this notion of black holes in the data, okay, missing data, the issue of missing data. Right. We're often presented with sequentially arranged data. There's a temporal aspect to it, but the temporal aspect is not in there. The only way you can see it is that it's represented sequentially. Now, tell me, where is the missing data? Can't tell, right? Largely primarily because a lot of our systems, in order to calculate and to create them, we substitute averages for those values, and we stick them in. But if you don't do that, okay, where's the missing data? The visual pattern creates it very quickly. Okay, so this allows you to then question, right? This allows you to then question whether those holes, those black holes, were there deliberately, or were they sort of accidentally, or our systems did not pick up those kinds of information, for example. But the minute you substitute it with information again, or with averages again, you lose that ability to find those things and question that. Then there's another kind of thing that we deal with. The third problem is that of what we call the brown worm problem. Okay, dealing with deceptive and misleading data. How do you go about identifying these things in our data sets? One way of doing that is that we need to understand. We need to understand what is it that we're trying to represent. We're trying to represent the nature of these arguments and the relationships between the evidence that are used to support those arguments, right? So what do we do? For example, Toulmin has got some very interesting descriptions about arguments and how those things can be broken down, or the nature of it, and how you can use them in talking about the nature of a claim and its supporting evidence, right? Now, there's something called warrant or relationship, or the rules for interpreting its validity or its authenticity and so on. Now, each of these claims would have a piece of information which could have other pieces of backing information that you want to be able to show. There may be conditions under which it works, and then you could string together a whole series of other sets of data to allow you to say, so that particular claim or conclusion that we're coming with, or an explanation for what we're observing, is grounded in these sets of data. Now, if I leave it as it is very hard or almost impossible for you to say what's valid, what's not. However, if I can tell you that there are some poor sources, or I can tell you that that piece of data is based on somebody else's conclusions, or that piece of data is based on somebody else's conclusions, on somebody else's conclusions, or based on somebody else's conclusions, then you start wondering, maybe I should reconsider some of this stuff. Now, it's even better if I say, look, those are the 3 pieces of data that you need to watch out for, right? And it would be even better if you could link them and say, look, I'm going to lift them up. I'm going to remove this brown worm. What would it do to my claim, to my conclusion? If there's no difference at the end of the day, then you're probably better off working without that set of data than you have with them, because they are weak evidence. So you need to be able to find ways in which you can show the strength of evidence in these kinds of representations. But this allows you to do that. Now, the basis on which that kind of representation concepts come about is that you're now no longer talking about just representing data. You're now trying to support, you're trying to visually support the thinking and the reasoning processes that go on. These are the relationships, and these are the nature of the relationships that exist in that thinking and reasoning process. So what we're trying to do is to be able to elaborate on some of these aspects of thinking that occurs in the investigative process. I'm not going to go through them in any kind of detail. Okay, and then of course it leads on to different types of inferencing. Whether you have data first or you have evidence first, and whether you have a conclusion first, and how you go about bringing them together, and there are different approaches to that. So I'm going to just leave you with those thoughts at the moment, because what we're going to say is, what we really want to do at the end of the day is, look, how do we create the visual supports for thinking and reasoning? We're not just creating visualizations.